Hey everybody, welcome back to Bible Funk the Duns. Today we're in Joshua chapter 1. Let's get started.
All right, Joshua chapter number 1. The book of Joshua is the record of the conquest. When Israel had been slaves in Egypt for 400 years, God brought them out, but he didn't just bring them out. He also had a plan to bring them into a promised land. And so he was bringing them into the promised land. Joshua records for us how that happens. So the bigger picture of all of this story is that this is the record of how God keeps his promise. It's a pillar in the ground that says that when God makes a promise, he always plans on keeping it. Now, here's something else that's happening in this book. I want you to notice the main kind of figure of this book is not Joshua. It's always God. Throughout the book and throughout this chapter, you're going to notice that God tells Joshua, matter of fact, 4 times in the chapter we read today, he tells Joshua to be strong and to be courageous. He tells him that in verse 6, 7, 9, and 18. So all through this. And what he's trying to say is that he's addressing Joshua's fear, not because Joshua didn't have fear. He's addressing Joshua's fear because Joshua does seem to have fear. And what's happening is, evidently God knows that he has fear, and instead of getting him in trouble about him, God comforts him. Now, what's happening here is one of my most favorite parts about this entire book. It's the fact that the promised land wasn't won by Joshua. It wasn't conquered by his armies or his tactics or his fighting. The promised land wasn't won. The promised land was given. All Joshua had to do was listen, obey, and trust. So that's what he does, the whole book. I also want you to see this, that the name Joshua is the Hebrew name Yeshua. When that name translates into English later, okay? So in the New Testament times when they're speaking Aramaic and they would have said the word Yeshua, they would have translated as Jesus. So Joshua means Jesus. Jesus means Joshua. Both names are the same. They mean God saves. And so Joshua is the figure in the Old Testament who took the people into the promised land. Jesus is the Joshua of the New Testament who takes us into a new promised land called heaven. Jesus does it all. This is a Jesus book. Remember, because God keeps his promises, I don't have to be afraid anymore. As a matter of fact, in every Christmas story, whether it's spoken to Joseph or to Mary, the first words spoken to Joseph and Mary at Christmas are the words, do not be afraid. What'd you get out of reading the Advent book today?
Okay, so in this Advent book, I really like how it goes over God's, Joshua, a little bit of background. So Joshua, he comes up right after Moses, and Moses was a really big deal because he is the one, he was the one that God used to bring the people out of slavery and into the promised land. And God used him to do a whole bunch of things. And so coming up right after Moses is Joshua. And so Joshua, he obviously has a lot to live up to. But God still helps Joshua in the same way that he helps Moses. And he still loves him in that same way. And since God is unchanging and we still have him today, and that means that God is still going to love us the same way and help us the same that he did then.
Yeah. Whenever if you went back in your Bible to like Deuteronomy chapter number 20, what you're going to find is you're going to find this same promise given to Moses that God is going to give to Joshua. So Deuteronomy chapter 20, about verse number 3, it says, "Hear, O Israel, today you are on the verge of battle with your enemies. Do not let your heart faint. Do not be afraid. Do not tremble or be terrified because of them. For the Lord your God is he who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies to save you." And so the same promise given to Moses is now being given to Joshua, that there'll be victory because of God's presence, which tells us this, that Moses, remember it begins in verse number 1 with the death of Moses. Moses may be dead and gone, but God isn't. That's the important thing. That's the big deal of this whole book. And matter of fact, there's an element here where we're supposed to be encouraged in faith. Now think about it like this. The big theme of this is do not be afraid, but have courage. All right. So Joshua is being encouraged. Okay. What's the sin? Do you remember the sin that kept Israel out of the promised land 40 years earlier? Do you remember what that was?
Complaint.
Okay, they were complaining, and remember they were on the verge of this promised land, and they sent in the 12 spies to go look at the land. The 12 spies come back to the nation of Israel, and they say, this land is too big, it's too scary, they've got walled cities, they've got giants, they've got these people we can't conquer, and they said, we're like grasshoppers in their sight, we'll never be able to do this. And the people stayed out of the promised land for 40 years. Their sin was the sin of disobedience because of fear. Their lack of courage is what kept them out. And so right at the beginning of this entry into the promised land, God says, listen, I hope you've learned this lesson because you're going to have to trust me. This is the story of how we can trust God even when we march into places that we've never been before. The Israelites had never been to the promised land, but listen, God had. God led them into the promised land. He didn't push them. At Advent, we celebrate the story of the God who became man to lead us into the true promised land of heaven through his grace at the cross. So as we read through here, make these connections and celebrate the goodness of God. Hope you have a great night. Keep reading. We'll see you tomorrow.
Bye.